Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our monthly Mornings with O'Keeffe program. I'm Katrina Latka, Curator of Education and Interpretation at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum. I would like to begin by recognizing the lands of the Pueblo people on which the sites of the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum stand. We recognize and honor their elders, past and present, and celebrate the vitality of their people today and into future generations. I offer this with humility and gratitude in acknowledgement of the need to confront the ongoing injustices of settler colonialism. I would like to extend a thank you to our members and donors who are here today. Your support has made this event possible. And if you're not yet a member and enjoy this program, please consider joining today. Visit gokm.org/membership to learn more. Throughout this talk, please place your questions in the chat, which can be found at the bottom or top of your screen, depending on your device. We'll try to answer as many as we can at the end of this conversation. Please note that following today's talk, a recording will be made available on the O'Keeffe Museum's website in about a week's time. Captions in both English and Spanish will be made available. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter this morning, Tim Gihring. Tim is the writer, producer, and host of The Object, an award-winning podcast from the Minneapolis Institute of Art. Based in Minneapolis, Gihring has been a journalist for more than 25 years, writing for the Associated Press, Minnesota Monthly, and other magazines and newspapers around the world. His research on O'Keeffe was featured in the April 2022 episode of The Object, Hiding in Plain Sight, the O'Keeffe We Never Knew. So Tim, we look forward to learning more from you today.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. Before I jump into my presentation, I do want to thank Katrina. As you can tell, I am in Santa Fe. In fact, I'm in the same room. And when Katrina asked if I would do this a few weeks ago, and she said, what date? I said, I'm actually going to be in Santa Fe. I'm based in Minneapolis, but I happen to be here. And I'm so glad that they could host me this morning. I was going to do this presentation from my Airbnb, and yesterday I got in from a trip and realized people were literally jackhammering outside my room. So that wasn't going to happen. But I'm so glad they let me push in this morning. I'm in Santa Fe at the museum, and so happy to be here. And I'm going to share my screen and start with our presentation. Okay, I do want to first tell you a little bit more about the podcast. If you're not familiar, The Object is produced at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. It's now in its 4th season. We talk about art at Minneapolis in our collection, but we extrapolate that to history and art history, and we talk about kind of the human side of art, who made it, how it came to the museum, and the broader context. We are now in the top 20% of all podcasts. And last year, we did win an award from the American Alliance of Museums, one of the trade organizations for museums. And you can find it wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or ask your smart speaker, your Alexa, to play the latest episode of The Object, and you can find it there. Just briefly, a little bit more about me. I am a Wisconsinite, just like Mrs. O'Keeffe. And my background is in journalism. I am not an art historian. I began working in journalism at the Associated Press, now nearly 30 years ago. And I came to the Minneapolis Institute of Art in 2013. And I do some of the same kind of work there. I bring art and history to life through storytelling. I look for the stories behind the art, and I try to give that context and give things a narrative to kind of bring these things to life and talk about who these artists were and again, how their art came into the museum. So I'm going to give a little presentation here, which is about my research that has a Minneapolis angle. And I want to start talking about what you're seeing here is the Artmobile. My research into Georgia O'Keeffe began when I was digging through the archives at the museum. And I came across some correspondence between a curator and Mrs. O'Keeffe. Now, the backstory is that in 1967, the museum bought a semi-tractor trailer and converted it into a mobile art gallery. That's what the inside of it looked like. It was nice. It had soft floors, music was piped in, and the art was not just stuff from storage, right? There were original paintings from Winslow Homer and John Singer Sargent. It was called the Artmobile, and it traveled around the state of Minnesota for years, going to small towns, even state prisons. And by 1973, it was being run by this irreverent curator named Michael Oker. And Oker decides he wants to show some Georgia O'Keeffe. So he writes to her. And he complains that all of her original work is being tied up in these universities trying to give her honorary degrees. And he tells her, quote, "There's no way in hell he would show a copy of her work." And at one point, he threatens to follow her around with this Artmobile as she collects these degrees. And finally, he asks for an audience at her house. And she writes back, "It's too late to have that Artmobile follow me around. I've given up collecting degrees." And then this supposed loner, this hermit, adds, "Come by if you have time." So here's the supposed hermit, this loner, right, inviting this kind of pushy stranger to her house, which made me question everything we're often told about O'Keeffe. Now, in the podcast, I start in Wisconsin, largely because I grew up there. But I wanted to skip ahead this morning to Texas, because Texas is where you get this kind of baseline O'Keeffe, right? Who she is before she becomes attached to Alfred Stieglitz. Now, in the 19-teens, O'Keeffe is teaching art off and on in Texas, in the Texas Panhandle, right? She's in her 20s, she's living with her teenage sister, and she's not shy. She's going out dancing, she's kissing a lot of guys. She's dressing in front of an open window when she knows she's being watched, and she loves it. We know this because a huge trove of her letters was published a couple years ago in a book called Georgia O'Keeffe's Wartime Texas Letters. The O'Keeffe Museum did a show about it last year. "Last night, I loved the starlight," she writes, "the dark, the wind, and the miles of the thin strip of dark that is land. It was wonderfully big." She's incredibly independent, free-spirited, strong-willed. In fact, she has a falling out with her landlady after she brings a man home to the house. "Why, of course I feel free," she writes. "It never occurred to me to feel any other way." So we know the baseline O'Keeffe. Fun-loving, social, highly independent. And Stieglitz sees this exactly the same way. He even worries what bringing her to New York might do to her. "Coming may bring you darkness instead of light," he warns her. But a few weeks later, she's in New York. Here's a painting from our collection in Minneapolis, one of my favorite early paintings of hers, City Night, 1926. So Stieglitz spends almost all of his time courting artists for his gallery, right? He's bringing them around to the house. O'Keeffe never knows how many people are going to come for dinner, only that she has to serve them all. And when he's not bombing around Greenwich Village in his trademark black cape, Stieglitz is in upstate New York with his big, loud, extended family, which O'Keeffe also can't stand. But Stieglitz is showing her work, he's making her famous, and he believes in her, which is kind of irresistible, right? She writes at some point in the 1920s, "I like being first, if I'm noticed at all. That's why I get on with Stieglitz. With him, I feel first. But in fact, she's not first, right? She finds out less than 5 years into their marriage that he's cheating on her, just like he cheated with her, with a much younger artist. So it's 1929. O'Keeffe is 41 now. She's been living in a hotel in Manhattan with Stieglitz. And now she can't stand the thought of another summer with him and his family. So she gets on a train. And 3.5 days later, she's in Santa Fe. Now, it would seem that O'Keeffe is coming to New Mexico to get away from everything and everyone. But in fact, she's getting away from one person in particular, right? Her husband, and maybe his family too. In any case, she's not alone. She's come to New Mexico with Rebecca Strand, the wife of the photographer Paul Strand, who ironically had been sent by Stieglitz to bring O'Keeffe from Texas to New York a decade earlier. And they meet up with a lot of other artists and supporters, some of whom are also getting away from their husbands, including the socialite Mabel Dodge Lujan, right, who's in this photo with O'Keeffe. Lujan had built her estate and a kind of art colony in Taos and has been trying to get O'Keeffe there for years, and finally she comes. As it turns out, of course, O'Keeffe loves New Mexico just like she loved Texas. And after 2 months in New Mexico, she writes to Stieglitz, "There is so much life in me. It makes me feel I'm growing very tall and straight inside and very still. Maybe you will not love me for it, but for me, it seems the best thing I can do for you." And she ends with, "I hope this letter carries no hurt to you. It is the last thing I want to do in the world." And Stieglitz simply writes to her, "I am broken." Now, to be fair, a lot of the correspondence between O'Keeffe and Stieglitz did not come to light until recently. The letters I just quoted were collected in a book called My Faraway One in 2011. And those letters from Texas we talked about came out in 2020. So for a long time, it may not have been clear to outsiders exactly what was motivating O'Keeffe to come to Santa Fe in the first place. In any case, here's a familiar photo. This print is from our collection in Minneapolis. Arnold Newman's photograph of Stieglitz and O'Keeffe from 1944. Stieglitz is looking very proud in his trademark black cape. O'Keeffe is looking downcast. In a sense, she doesn't leave New York so much as he leaves one New Yorker in particular, right? Who would never feel comfortable in New Mexico, and she knows it. So when she gets back from New Mexico in 1929, she makes a kind of deal with Stieglitz. "I'll stay with you part of every year. I'll feed you, I'll feed your friends. I'll show up to your parties. I'll even look the other way at your other women. You be you. But then I'm gone the rest of the year." And he says, "Okay." Here's a painting from our collection, Black Place 1, 1945. O'Keeffe gets a place at the Ghost Ranch, right? And she paints. She paints a lot in what she calls the Black Place, like this picture, the Black Place 1. These hills that she says are like a mile of elephants. There's another painting from our collection in Minneapolis, seen from the Ghost Ranch, an hour outside of Santa Fe. It's not like she's alone, though, or wants to be. Ansel Adams, Marsden Hartley, Willa Cather, Aldous Huxley, D.H. Lawrence, they're all coming around to this area. O'Keeffe goes riding in Yosemite with Adams. She goes camping with the photographer Todd Webb. In a letter to Webb, she writes, "I'm at the ranch house and am very pleased to be here just with the desert. And yet," she adds, "you are not here enough." Here's one of my favorite photos, a lot of people's favorite photo, O'Keeffe with Orville Cox in 1937. Orville is the head wrangler at the Ghost Ranch, and when when she and Adams and a number of other people go camping, he kind of accompanies them. This month-long camping trip into the Four Corners area. This is not something that hermits do, and this is not a face that hermits make. Of course, she doesn't just travel around the Southwest or even California, that area. She goes to Peru, she goes to Japan. Definitely not something that hermits do. But that's how Stieglitz is marketing her, right? As this kind of lonely savant of the desert, which is how she must appear to him. And after he dies in 1946, and he's not marketing her anymore, she kind of fades from view, right? By the 1950s, she's appearing in an article in Newsweek called Where Are They Now? And to many people in the 1950s, an older woman living without a man in the desert with a bunch of animal skulls probably seems strange and maybe even suspicious, which is where one of my favorite O'Keeffe anecdotes comes in the form of the FBI. Picture of Los Alamos National Laboratory in 1974. So where O'Keeffe lives in Abiquiu is just 25 miles north of the laboratory. And she's the only person in town, an informant tells the FBI, who voted for Henry Wallace, who was the progressive candidate for president in 1948. And he tells the FBI, quote, her political philosophy doesn't sound entirely American. So in 1953, the FBI decides to spy on her. They watch her house, they watch her mail. And what they find is that she's sending letters to people all over the world, and that a Chinese or Filipino man is watching her house while she's gone, and that she, quote, frequently entertains guests of foreign extraction at her house. They don't like it, but in less than a year, they close the file. O'Keeffe may be unusual in Eisenhower America, but she's neither dangerous nor a loner. Now, in 1966, Life magazine sends a photographer out to find her. And the photographer spends 3 days hanging out with O'Keeffe, walking, talking, laughing. Quote, she had a reputation of being a hermit, the photographers would later say, but she couldn't have been more friendly, which isn't exactly what the magazine was hoping for. So the story sits on the shelf for 2 years, until in 1968, O'Keeffe suddenly seems downright countercultural, and Life puts her on the cover, 1968. And people read about her back to the land lifestyle and how she grows her own vegetables and why she collects animal skulls. People read this and they start looking at maps of New Mexico. Here's a photo from the article now in the collection of the Minneapolis Institute of Art. I think people underestimate today just how big the Back to the Land movement was in the 60s, 70s, into the early 80s. People start moving out of big cities, right, into small towns, including artists, writers, musicians. And O'Keeffe becomes this kind of guiding star for the movement, even though she wants nothing to do with it. She's been out in the country for 50 years, and suddenly all these hippies are coming around. And she's having to chase them off her property. And it just kind of feeds this myth, right? The artist who wants to be left alone. But think about it. If you had strangers calling you, wanting to drop by your house, trying to steal things off your property, you'd want to be left alone too. By 1970, when she gets this major retrospective at the Whitney in New York, the attention only gets worse, right? And by then she's 85 and her eyesight is failing. She paints her last picture unassisted in 1972. And yet she still takes these calls from strangers who come into town and call her from the store. People like Joni Mitchell are dropping by with their poetry and their paintings and things they want to share with her. There's a story about Joni Mitchell when she stops by. She has this small painting that she did. She's just getting started in painting. And O'Keeffe looks at it and she's like, maybe you should stop smoking. Things like that. And yet she's still taking calls. She's still inviting this pushy curator from Minneapolis to come say hello, right? So there's a difference, I think, between being a loner and being someone who wants to be left alone. Which brings me to my kind of final anecdote. It's 1983. O'Keeffe returns again to New York, this time for a major Stieglitz show at the Met. And Andy Warhol, of all people, interviews her for his Interview magazine. Probably at this point, the two most recognizable living artists in America, right? Sitting down to lunch. And O'Keeffe couldn't be less interested. As much as Warhol is obsessed with celebrity, O'Keeffe wants nothing to do with it. Warhol tries to tell her, you should wear contacts, even though she's 96 and mostly blind. He tells her she should go out and see the city, see this Philip Johnson building that went up. And she says, I've lived there. Finally, O'Keeffe tells him, I've lived up there at the end of the world by myself a long time. You walk around with your thing out in the field and nobody cares. It's nice. So that's what I have for my presentation. And I'm going to turn back to our stop share and turn back for some questions and talk to Katrina a little bit, and then we'll take some questions from the audience.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim. And certainly if there's anyone who has questions from our audience, please put them in the chat and we'll make sure to get to them as well. So Tim, I have a question for you.
Okay.
Which is, how do you feel that your background in journalism has prepared you for the work that you have done on the object? And as a follow-up to that, are there any great examples for how that dogged journalism research helped to lead you to some great behind-the-scenes information about works or artists in the MIA collection?
Yeah, thank you for that. Well, what I like to say often about what I do at the museum is that everything at a museum is out of context, almost everything. Like nothing was made to be in the museum, right? So as a journalist, one of the things I do is try to find that context and tell the story of how things came to the museum, who made it, who acquired it, what was that journey, and fill in that context for the viewer, the reader, the listener, in our case, with the podcast. And some of the things that I have kind of uncovered, if you will, when I do interviews for the podcast, one of the stories, we have this piece at the museum, this Rembrandt, it's called Lucretia. It was kind of one of our signature pieces that came into the museum early on, 1935. We were only 20 years old as a museum. And I talked to one of the descendants of the woman who sold it to the museum. And he told me that the reason it came was that she had a big family. She had a number of kids. And rather than try to figure out which one of them would get this painting, she figured out that none of them would get it. Mm-hmm. And decided the museum would get it instead. And that maybe that would quell some of the squabbling within the family. It didn't, as it turned out. There were some brothers who didn't speak to each other after that. But that was one. Another one was, we have this piece at the museum, sort of pre-Columbian piece called the Chalk Mule. And we got this in 1947, and it was a centerpiece of the museum. And it traveled Europe. We had no reason to think it wasn't what it was supposed to be, which is this kind of reclining figure from Mesoamerica. And in the 1970s, finally, we got a curator who knew a little bit more about it and looked at it and said, no, that's a fake. And we took it off you. And it's now kind of a thing that we'll pull out when we might. A few years ago, we had an exhibition that was partly about fakes, and we put that on view. So I decided to look into how did that happen? What was the story? How did this become known as a fake? And so I looked up some of the curators who had worked with it around that time. And one of them told me, I'm kind of having second thoughts. Like maybe we were too hasty. I thought, wow, okay. So then I talked to the research director at the Getty Institute, whose specialty is in pre-Columbian art. She says, oh no, definitely a fake. And she was able to find me a photograph of this piece of art, like out in the garden of like the neighbor of the dealer who sold it to us, who has since become known as a very notorious dealer in fakes, particularly in pre-Columbian art. He was running kind of a chop shop for pieces like this.
Dear.
Yeah. So anyway, those are the kind of stories that I enjoy digging up, and as a journalist, kind of draw the facts of the matter. In art history, we often get a lot of dates and we get a lot of facts. And so it's kind of what I've sort of taken on is sort of pulling that together into a narrative. And we know that people learn from storytelling. We know that storytelling is a way to engage people in things. And in this case, it's become a way to engage people in the art.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There was a great follow-up question here in the chat. In that research, what was the most interesting thing that you found personally about O'Keeffe?
Yeah, I think what I found is someone who, again, I think I mentioned like this line between a loner and someone who wants to be left alone. And I just became very sympathetic to this idea that when you have that attention focused on you, how do you deal with that? And from my own research into the archive, and this curator from Minneapolis who was reaching out, and she was very open to this. It seemed like what I learned was someone who was really dedicated to her work, but also wanted to share that to the world. And how do you find that balance as an artist? She couldn't find that in New York, it would seem. Between her husband and her big family, his big family. The other thing I found, and we didn't talk about, is who this curator was. And as it turns out, he was a Native American, or at least I don't know what his tribal affiliation was, if he had any. But he died a few years ago, and he had his memorial service at a Native American church in Minneapolis. And after he left the museum, he went on to work for some Native American arts organizations. And I don't know if that came through in their correspondence or how that worked out, but I also think, she was open to that as well. She was sympathetic to that. And so what I loved finding was this person who was able to negotiate her own celebrity, which was sort of forced upon her, and also doing the work that she wanted to do.
Thank you so much. And we're seeing like just so many comments come in the chat.
Yeah, let's go with that.
In reference to writings and other books that folks are able to follow up on. And I did want to mention that there is a wonderful publication where folks can read about O'Keeffe's correspondence with Stieglitz, and it's called My Faraway One. So I'll put a link to that in the chat as well.
Yeah, well, Katrina, if I could, I would love to ask you, for people who come to visit the museum and visitor homes here, how does that myth, the legend that people might be coming with, do you see that kind of playing out in a different way, or that people come away with a different perspective once they see what her life was like here in New Mexico?
That's such a great question. And, I appreciate folks also mentioning this in the chat, that they have visited Santa Fe, or that they visited her historic home and studio in Abiquiu. That perspective you gain from visiting this place, this very special place, really gives you a sense of why New Mexico is and was so special to her as an artist, and why she lived here in the last several decades of her life. And in fact, yes, we certainly feel that the experience that you gain from visiting both the museum, the land, her home, gives a sense of perspective. And you certainly felt that as well, kind of coming into town and seeing why it is different from other parts of the United States.
Yeah.
O'Keeffe definitely had an affinity for very simply the light, the landscape, the crystal clear skies, both during the daytime and at night. And all of those things were very special to her, especially as an artist. So certainly folks come away from that experience having a very different perspective of who she was, why she lived here, and the way that she lived, very intentionally, as you pointed out. She had a very close relationship with gardening, for example, intentionally canning and preserving foods with the help of some staff at her homes.
Yeah.
So yes, that was a very important point to make, that that relationship with the land was very important to her.
Yeah, I think you and I talked before this program that even though her homes are relatively close, I mean, they're about an hour away though.
Yes.
Even now. And so back in the day, 50s, 60s, it would have been even further away. And so, and she didn't necessarily come into town, as it were, Santa Fe.
Correct.
All that often.
Yeah, I mean, the homes that she eventually owned in Abiquiu and at the Ghost Ranch are not here in Santa Fe. The museum is apart from those places. So I think that is surprising to some folks when they come to visit the galleries here, is that those three locations are pretty far apart. Yeah. And in fact, the experience between these three locations is very different. And the reason why she had these two separate homes, both in Abiquiu and at Ghost Ranch, is the landscapes are just so very different. And that is one of the surprising things when people come to New Mexico, is that we're at a high elevation. You noted it was a little cool here, actually, in the morning. And we do have the seasons. And you know, she was able to experience all of those things in a very different manner between those two homes and paint them and capture them through her art.
Yeah. Something else I wanted to ask, because I don't get into this in the podcast or in my presentation today, but you know, when we think about her never really being alone, we know that she had caretakers, and we know that, you know, she had people who not only took care of her, but also the home, and those people still have maybe some relationship with her legacy. Could you talk a little bit about those families and how she related to them?
Sure. Yeah, I think that is a misconception that, and this of course is the title of your presentation of the podcast, that she was very much alone in the desert. And that really was not the case at all. Right. So yeah, certainly at her properties, at her homes, she lived and worked alongside many people who were very close to her. So of course of note is the Lopez family, who still works with the museum very closely, and a number of other people who worked throughout you know, her properties. So she was not all alone. You know, it was a very social atmosphere at times. So as you noted, she also hosted guests. And there are certainly some folks who mention in the chat here that they had relatives or friends or know people who did in fact show up at the homes and met her. So it is fascinating to see that is a myth debunked.
Yeah. You know, what I often find when I research celebrities or people whose legend sort of becomes larger than life, that there is sort of the popular conception that finds its way into books and movies, and then there are the people who actually knew them, and those can be very different. Yes. And I wonder if there are people who still have that connection to her, who get in contact with the museum or still have that connection who have shared some of those kind of stories?
Yes, and we always love to hear from folks who have that personal connection, who have a story to tell.
Mhm.
So we certainly want those folks to get in touch with us,
Yeah.
because we know as the years pass, those stories may go from memory,
Absolutely.
and people may eventually leave us. So
Right.
it's important for us to capture those memories while they're here.
Yeah. I mean, that's something that I've always been really fascinated by. And then sort of a personal note, I moved to Minneapolis from Milwaukee. And one of the reasons was because of Bob Dylan.
Mm.
Not that I knew him, but I knew his legacy was there. And so when I got there, I just started asking around, right? And I'd go to a concert of musicians that I knew he had played with. And where you just sort of hear things, when I'm doing a story about music or people in that world, we might talk about that a little bit. And the stories would be far different from the kind of things you might see in a documentary. And I've always just, that sort of human perspective, I think, is not only really interesting, but I think also really valuable to understand their work. That these weren't people who just came out of nowhere to create a work of genius. That genius was fed by their surroundings, by the people they interacted with. When we think about O'Keeffe being a loner, the likelihood of someone creating something of such originality and genius, that doesn't line up with being a loner. That lines up with having lots of influences and rubbing shoulders with people and finding just a different perspective on it. So in some ways, like for me, looking at George O'Keeffe is the culmination of looking at other geniuses who have, that we hold up as being true originals. And certainly they are original in their sense of having a fresh way of looking at things. But what we know about these folks is that does come from being as part of a group and part of like-minded people, or just pulling things from here and there. And I think that in and of itself suggests that, she wasn't just out in the desert, just thinking of things out of nowhere. This was from other artists, other circles that she moved in, and certainly the art colony that she, tapped into out here in New Mexico.
Yeah, they're all hand in glove for certain.
Yeah.
So a few people have mentioned your noting her FBI investigation.
Yeah.
And it was mentioned that her FBI file, although redacted, is actually available online.
Sure. Yeah. All these things are redacted. The FBI, strangely enough, as a part of the bureaucracy, has gotten out in front of some of these quote unquote celebrity files that they collected over the years, and you can search for them. There was also a journalist before me who had done a Freedom of Information Act request to look at those files. And so, my work was done for me in that sense. Some of the things that I found interesting there in that kind of Hoover era, FBI, where everyone from Marilyn Monroe to Liberace was under investigation for something. In her case, her file had a C at the end of its title, and that stood for communist. Because again, like this informant was thinking that the candidate that she voted for, again, the only person in, I don't know, the Abiquiu area, he was advocating closer relations with Russia, of all things. And so that right there was a red flag for them. I mean, anyone who was in support of that might have communist sympathies. But again, what they found, it's sort of like, kind of egg on their face, right? They start looking at her, and in fact, she's not, kind of like a agitator, just living out here just to get away from scrutiny. But she's having all these, fellow artists at her home, and she's traveling. She's gone a lot, frankly. And when they look at her mail, she's corresponding with people all over. And they did also ask some of their agents in New York, where she sort of maintained, she had a relationship there too. And once again, they found just, she had the typical sort of gallery relationships. And I think they closed the file like within 3 months. They're just like, you know what, there's nothing here. But, in the 50s, in the McCarthy era, they were barking up every tree they could think of, hoping that she wasn't like influencing her followers.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So very simply from the chat, someone asked, what made you interested in O'Keeffe in the first place?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. I mean, as a journalist, I'm always looking for kind of new angles on things. And when I kind of get a hunch that things aren't as they seem, that's when I get really interested. And again, so the way it started, in 2015, the Minneapolis Institute of Art turned 100 years old. And I did a number of stories kind of digging through our own archives, just to see, what kind of correspondence was out there and how collecting and those sorts of relationships have changed over time, correspondence with dealers and what have you. And when I came across the Artmobile stuff, I got very curious. A, what the heck was this Artmobile? And B, whatever came of this. As it turned out, the Artmobile was shut down that same year, 1973. So there never was any opportunity. That's sort of the end of that story, is a kind of wah-wah. But by and large, I'm interested in sort of the truth behind things. And then I became interested from a personal angle. Again, I'm from Wisconsin. And I grew up in the 70s and 80s knowing O'Keeffe was from there. But also, she was talked about in such a way of like, how did that ever come to be, because she was so closely associated with the Southwest. And as it turns out, when I was, a young kid, the area where she grew up, the township, finally decided to commemorate her in a way, and they named a park after her. You may or may not know this anecdote. It was right around the time that her farmhouse burned down, and they decided to name this park after her. And they also at the same time asked her if she would donate an original painting for their local museum. And she said no and no. And at the time they took that kind of harshly, and they decided, well, heck, if she's not interested in us, we're not interested in her. And they renamed the park. And they kind of pushed her aside. And again, it was this sort of misunderstanding, what does she mean when she kind of draws boundaries? And I think what we've learned since then is that it was right around the time that she was losing her eyesight, and she was fairly self-conscious about it. And so I think there's reason to believe that she didn't want to come up to Wisconsin to attend this, because she was trying to keep that somewhat to herself. She didn't necessarily want word getting out about that. But also, again, this like we see with the correspondence of, the universities are all trying to give her honorary degrees. She didn't want to spend all of her time going around being honored. She wanted to do the work. And people kind of took that maybe in the wrong way of like, well, heck, okay, we're reaching out to you. But, I try to see it as someone who has both interviewed a number of, famous people, and I like to think I have some understanding of what that world might be. You try to draw boundaries. And I think a lot of what people took to mean that she was maybe a misanthrope or that she didn't like people, was really her just trying to create some boundaries, at a time when, people were holding her up as part of this movement that she really didn't ask to be a part of. And we're just coming around. Again, you see the same thing with Bob Dylan, people coming around Woodstock, where he was trying to get away from the folks who were going through his garbage in New York. I'm very sympathetic, having done this story, to just trying to create enough space for her to do the work and also still be out in the world and relate to people.
Gosh, what a great way of putting it, because yes, she was in fact quite famous in her lifetime.
Yeah.
And certainly at the museum, we hear all the time that people want to understand her as the person behind the art. And that has been a shift from how fine art museums used to approach the dissection of the work of art.
Yeah.
And folks really want to know the person behind the piece.
Yeah.
So that's what we're trying to get to the heart of all the time, is the fact behind the myth. Yeah. And that's really why we had you here today. So thank you for shedding that kind of journalistic look at those facts behind O'Keeffe. And we love digging into that all the time.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is something that I've seen change even within the time I've been at the museum. Kind of shifting people's understanding from talk about color and form and line to this idea that everything in a museum was made by somebody somewhere at some time for some reason. And once you kind of understand that context, it opens up a much more humanistic way of looking at art. And I think that's great.
Yeah. Well, it seems like folks in the chat agree, and they are appreciative of the presentation. I see many folks also asking if they could listen to this presentation again at another time. And yes, in fact, we are recording the presentation. It'll be available on our website in about a week's time with captions. Thank you so very much for being with us here today.
Oh gosh, thank you so much. And thanks again for having me literally here in Santa Fe.
Yes, yes. Well, thank you all for being with us here as well. See you all next time.